All right. I hope everything's working here. Good morning, everyone. My name is Kelsey Trott, and I'm a master's student in psychology at the University of Regina. The research I'm presenting on today has been completed in collaboration with Dr. Rick Riddell, the U of R Department of Justice Studies, and it's a bit different from my current work in my program, but I do have a fair amount of interest in criminal justice, and he was kind enough to take some time from his normal duties to teach me a little bit from his side of things. And today I'll be discussing our research on public perceptions of trust and confidence in police across 110 countries. So as I'm sure everyone who's following the media is aware, there's current calls for police reform. It's predominantly in the USA. However, there are plenty of areas for improvement in policing across the globe, including Canada. We were interested in current public perceptions of the police, given this growing call for reform. There have been many high-profile incidences involving police that have drawn public concern over the past couple of months and many years, technically. But events like the George Floyd incident in Minneapolis, Colton Boushie case here in Saskatchewan a couple of years ago, Robert Jacansky out in BC at the airport, and even as far back if you go to Rodney King in Los Angeles. So we looked at data on trust and confidence in police and found that these areas were relatively consistent within and amongst the countries that had been collecting and reporting on it. Much of the data has remained fairly stable based on the reports on public views of police. So some of the sources that we used for our research included the World Values Survey, Gallup, Lloyd's Register Foundation, and Angus Reid. These agencies reach across large populations. However, they do not all report findings from large numbers of countries, which is why we use the multiple sources of data. So what's the importance to these questions? The discussion of trust and confidence in police has been studied in criminal justice in a variety of ways, such as how police are perceived by the people that they serve. The purpose of our research was to look at current data and opinions about confidence in the police, as prior research has shown that when people have high levels of trust and confidence in police, or perceive the police as being more positive, people are more willing to report crimes and cooperate with the investigations. This in turn leads to less crime in their communities where there is cooperation. And if a population has trust and confidence in police, it is an indication that they're efficient, and it would likely follow that the communities would be safer and people would have a higher quality of life. We use the following theoretical explanations to explore and better understand relationships between police and society. Previous research has outlined areas with higher crime have less confidence in police due to the increased occurrence of violence crimes against the people. It's likely in part because marginalized communities do have higher rates of serious crime, which in turn they have less confidence in police to help them. Developing nations have less confidence, which may be in part that local police do not have sufficient resources or training to do their jobs in a proper fashion compared to richer countries where police are better trained and are more selective on who becomes a police officer. They also have better equipment and resources to do their jobs properly. Fragile nations often have less economic and civil freedoms, which leads to less confidence in government institutions, which includes the police. Corruption will lead to less trust and confidence in police if they're being paid to look the other way, ignore the crimes of the rich or powerful, or not investigating criminals who are paying them bribes. So the prior research has looked at perceptions of police using a variety of methods and constructs. There are cross-national studies that compared countries based on levels of development or similar geographies. Political, economic, and measures of freedom are often used in these analyses. Different time periods offer different generational perspectives of the views of police. Different indicators of trust and confidence have also varied as well. Some researchers directly ask people about trust and confidence, and others have used measures that indirectly ask them. For example, the Lloyd's Registry Foundation asked people in 2018 the following question. Suppose you had lost a small bag that contained items of great financial value to you that had your name and address written on it. If it were found by the police, how likely is it that it would be returned to you with all of its contents? This question indirectly relates to trust in the police to do the right thing in this situation and return the bag. So for the purpose of our current study was to examine trust and confidence in police using a large sample of nations. We used an ordinary least squared regression and hypothesized that consistent with previous research, trust would be higher in developed nations with higher income and political stability, along with lower levels of crime. Our sample had 110 nations in it. All had at least 1 million citizens as a minimum. We excluded war-torn or states that were unstable, and there was a large variation in per capita GDP amongst these countries. It was difficult to add more countries due to the lack of economic, political, and crime-related variables. And I guess just as a point of reference, there's about 180 independent nations of the world. So we were able to get data from approximately, or from 110 of those approximate 180. The dependent variables that we used in the analysis, the Law and Order Index is calculated by Gallup polls, and it measures confidence in local police based on some factors of whether they fear crime or if they've been victimized over the past year. The Global Police Index, which is calculated by Tynes Etzbeth, measures police efficiency, authoritarianism, accountability, and corruption. The independent variables that we used were per capita GDP, which is calculated by World Bank. Higher scores indicate richer nations, which is a measure of general wealth. The Fragile State Index is calculated with lower scores indicating more stability in the nation based on the volatility amongst the different groups within a nation that could lead to conflict and instability. Corruption Index is calculated by Transparency International, and higher scores being less corrupt on measures of corruption within the public sector. Government effectiveness, calculated by World Bank, measures political stability, accountability, corruption, lack of violence, and lower scores indicate more effective government. The Civil Liberties Scale is calculated by Freedom House, and higher scores are less free based on measures like freedom of expression and equality. Violent crimes calculated by the United Nations, and it's a score based on homicides per 100,000 people, and higher numbers indicate higher homicide rates. And finally, urban percentage is a score that calculates the percentage of people living in cities versus rural populations. So again, our methodology was the 7 independent variables were used in a single ordinary least squared model regression with 110 nations to look at the 2 different predictor variables. So our first set of results with the Global Police Index, and again, that was a scale that measured police on efficiency, authoritarianism, accountability, and corruption. Civil Liberties Scale had a significant positive relationship, while corruption, government effectiveness, Fragile State Index, and urban percentage were negatively related. The adjusted R-square was very good, accounting for 76.5% of the variation. So some of the key findings from this were that lower levels of government effectiveness, less fragile states, and less corruption have higher levels of police efficiency. Nations with more civil liberties have less confidence in police. Rural populations have higher confidence in police efficiency. And crime and GDP did not have any significant relationships with the measure of police efficiency. The results from the Gallup's Law and Order Index, and that was the measure that was based on confidence in police if they had been a victim of crime over the previous year and if the respondents feared crime. Civil liberties and government effectiveness had significant positive relationships. Homicide rate, fragile state, and urban percentage were significantly negatively related. The adjusted R-square again was respectable, taking into account 63.4% of the variation. So the key findings from this were that higher levels of government effectiveness were associated with higher levels of police confidence. Lower homicide rates were associated with higher levels of reported police confidence. Higher civil liberties had less confidence in police. Countries with higher levels of rural populations reported more confidence in police. People in less fragile states had more confidence, and corruption and per capita GDP did not have a significant relationship. So how to apply these findings to Canadian samples? The findings were interesting and confirmed much of what we had anticipated based on the previous research. It does show us that trust and confidence in police, it's a pretty dynamic relationship. Public perception of police in Canada is complex and similar to the results of the cross-national data. Overall, both of the dependent variables indicated that rural populations have more confidence and trust in police. And these findings of rural support are similar to statistics in Canada, where there are many residents living in rural areas who tend to have a more favorable attitude toward police compared to those living in cities. It also indicated that countries with higher civil liberties had less confidence in police. Canada also has higher civil liberties, and these less favorable views would follow some of the similar trends that we have been observing recently in the media as far as public perception of police. So moving forward, we plan to continue to follow these trends in data to calculate the measures, as there's still plenty of calls for police reform and many areas where improvements can be made. Confidence and trust in police are important measures for the citizens who rely on them. It is also beneficial for police forces to use this data in their respective work towards reforming their policies. There are many police forces that calculate their own data, and we could use their data to compare along with the independent data sources to see how they compare. It would serve the police force as well to use the data, good or bad, to adapt based on how they are viewed by their citizens. Canadian data on trust and confidence would be valuable for a national idea of these views, as well as a measure of comparison from other countries. This allows the police forces to mobilize their efforts in reform based on their immediate needs from their citizens and as a comparison to their peers on the international stage. So in closing, I'd just like to thank everyone for attending today, and as well as for all the hard work done behind the scenes by the organizers of the conference. I've really enjoyed the last couple of days, and I'm looking forward to the rest of today, and I'll be happy to answer any of the questions that pop up at the end of the panel. Just a few references, and that is it.
Thank you so much, Kelsey. I think your findings are consistent with what we're seeing in many societies right now, especially across Canada. If you have any questions for Kelsey, I encourage you to add those in the Q&A box, and we'll get to those after all of the presentations. So now I'd like to turn the floor over to Christopher Schneider from the University of Brandon. I think we can all agree, Christopher, you're quite brave for using Twitter as a research source. I'm sure that added to some frustration and angst as well. I'd now like to turn to our next presentation. So we now will be hearing from Kelly Gorkoff from the University of Winnipeg, Nadine Bartlett from the University of Manitoba, Cassandra Dokken from the Department of Justice, Rebeca Heringer from the University of Manitoba, Mehmet Yavuz from the University of Manitoba, and Natassia D'Sena from the University of Winnipeg. They will be speaking about networked architectures of crime prevention. Please turn on your mic and or camera and take it away.
Great, thank you. And thanks to the two previous presentations, that was great. So today we're going to be presenting our thoughts on one segment of our multi-pronged, multi-method, two-year SSHRC-funded study on community mobilization. We're going to be talking about the governance section today. And we're going to attempt a team presentation, so you can bear with us as we try to do that. So myself, I'm here. Nadine is from the Faculty of Education at University of Manitoba. Rebeca and Mehmet are both PhD students in Peace and Conflict Studies. Natassia is a master's student at University of Winnipeg, and Cassandra is our research partner with Manitoba Justice. So crime prevention programs in Canada have expanded considerably in the past 30 years. Crawford and Garland refer to this as the preventative turn in crime policy. Programs have taken a variety of different kinds of social forms. Crime prevention programs have recently adopted a community mobilization framework. While there's considerable critique and concern about this turn, some of which I'll discuss below, there's really little concrete evidence, particularly in Canada, about how programs are organized, governed, and practiced. So our study examines 12 mobilization projects in Manitoba to assess if they represent a mechanism by which community groups have the ability to co-produce community-grounded definitions and practices of public safety, or if they represent a continued form of authoritative crime control. So the literature discusses three kinds of phases of crime prevention. Throughout the 1990s, crime prevention practices adopted an interorganizational partnership focus. These included programs like policing partnerships with women's groups to deal with family violence, or school partnering with recreation programs to provide after-school programming for idle youth. These methods were thought to be an advanced way to prevent crime outside of the official system of arrest and deterrence, and represented a shift in policing away from professional traditional models to community policing. Initially, programs were highly localized, based on individualized situational crime prevention ideals. It's argued that these practices produced a shift in thinking about crime prevention and justice away from social welfare responses to address widespread social inequalities, to neoliberal, highly individualized and responsibilized mechanisms, and ushered in forms of law and order policing that include zero tolerance, stop and frisk, and carding. The second phase is what Crawford and Evans call the institutionalization of crime prevention. So this is things like standalone departments of crime prevention, and as well as the adoption of risk instruments in criminal justice practice. The current phase of crime prevention is what Crawford and Carson call crime prevention in the austerity decade, where the provision of public services are reduced and this occurs in a particular time where there's an intensification of social problems, poverty, unemployment, crime, racial unrest. Part of the austerity phase involves connecting a wide range of groups and agencies not previously involved in direct crime prevention to share resources. Still, most third wave prevention programs are based in long identified markers of crime causation and still use the language of risk-focused prevention. And of course, there's considerable critiques of risk-focused prevention, which include how risk is used to divide and classify, how it subjects individuals to increased police surveillance, how it's associated with what Zedner calls pre-crime. So our focus on community mobilization programs are studied in this backdrop. Community mobilization is defined as a process where individuals, groups, and organizations in a community come together to address particular social issues associated with health, safety, crime prevention, and community development. Programs look really different based on location and community and often incorporate a broad range of stakeholders. Depending on the nature of the involvement, some communities have been found to disrupt traditional hierarchies of power, foster individual agency, activate communities, share decision-making, and co-produce social safety. But little, again, is known exactly about these projects. So our project is guided by Carson's optimism when he asks, how can an appropriate agenda be established and promoted, one that would in practice challenge the firm adherence to unreflexive ideas of crime control and encompass practices arising from local contingencies and uniqueness of governance? So that question guides our research, supported by other questions here. What are the power dynamics, statutory requirements? How about the voluntary sector? And what we're thinking about today is what is the actual architecture or structure of community mobilization networks? So to interrogate the governance structures of community mobilization networks, our work engages in literature on nodal networks. Nodal networks are defined by Wood and Shearing as organizational sites that bring together institutions to shape the flow of events. Hawley and Shearing suggest that coordination between nodes is made possible via networks. When this happens, governance shifts from a centralized body or agency to many nodes who are connected via a network, where it says that governance can be co-produced and collaborative. So nodal networks often overlap and intersect. They can be localized within communities. They can be interinstitutional. They can be transnational. They can also be entirely virtual, and they can change over time. Networks and the nodal assemblages often involve iterative processes carried out by different actors that occupy different positions of influence. The form taken varies greatly with program area and topic. So DuPont says that the information and resources flow across nodal networks depends on the structure and macro situational properties and how social connections exist among actors. We are interested in the governance structure of community mobilization initiatives and are interested in Johnson and Shearing's claim that evidence of nodal governance is becoming more and more apparent. As it does, opportunities may arise to transform networked relations in ways that could, under the right circumstances, advance conditions of just and democratic outcomes. So by examining the framework of community mobilization in Manitoba, we theorize about how nodal networks can provide room for a progressive communal approach discussed by Carson. And now I'll turn it to Nadine.
Thanks, Kelly. Canadian community mobilization models. Collaborative community-based approaches to crime prevention and community safety are a focus at the federal and provincial levels. At the federal level, the National Strategy on Community Safety and Crime Prevention provides a policy framework to support community-based initiatives that seek to reduce and prevent crime. There's been a strong uptake for community mobilization frameworks in Canada. The hub model of collaborative risk-driven intervention has been adopted in over 60 communities throughout the country, leading to it being referred to as Canada's hub model. The hub model involves convening a multi-sector service providers around a hub or situation table to address individuals' needs who are experiencing acutely elevated risk. If an individual is deemed to be experiencing acutely elevated risk, limited information is shared across the sectors and risk mitigating interventions are deployed. While the hub model has been widely adopted, two main critiques have materialized. First, it's been critiqued for employing a state-centric focus, and second, it's been critiqued for reinforcing the dominance of a police agenda. In Saskatchewan, where the hub model originated, the focus on the standardization of community mobilization throughout the province is essentially a critique of state-centric models and the role of government in directing, controlling, and evaluating community mobilization. This approach appears to contradict the original intention of community mobilization, which is to work with and through the communities served. An evaluation of the hub also described the central and leadership role of police as a further limitation and recommended that leadership and ownership needed to be more equitably distributed amongst other sectors. In Ontario, a similar pattern was found. In that province, community mobilization involves collaboration between police services, government ministries, but unlike Saskatchewan, it includes community agencies and partners. While a strength in Ontario may be that it includes community agencies and partners, there are significant questions about how the power, authority, and agency of community partners and communities are exercised within this structure, and the degree to which governance is co-produced and collaborative. Since Ontario also focuses on the standardization of community mobilization, it appears there may be limited space to employ unreflexive practices of crime control that are driven by local contingencies. In a review of community mobilization by Langen, they argued that the police are not simply situated as one node amongst many, but instead maintain an anchoring role in the network's development, implementation, and governance. Next slide, please. The Manitoba models. So unlike Saskatchewan and Ontario, the provincial government of Manitoba has remained relatively distant from community mobilization initiatives. While community mobilization is a key priority in crime prevention within two government of Manitoba strategies, they have not imposed a one-size-fits-all approach. Instead, there is government support for innovative and made in Manitoba solutions to crime prevention and community safety. This has meant that local communities have the autonomy to develop and implement approaches to community mobilization that best address their local needs. And the model there involves numerous agencies participating together, which is not apparent in the models that we've previously discussed. Local autonomy is particularly important in Manitoba, given the history of Indigenous interactions with settler colonial governments. There are currently 12 community mobilization initiatives in Manitoba, many of which have been designed at the local level to address the unique needs and priorities of the communities served. They each represent a local service providers, community members, and government institutions like education, for example, addiction support, and policing. This kind of dispersed model of governance can contribute to a kind of catalytic effect on crime prevention. This kind of catalytic effect appears to be taking place in Manitoba, where transformative and progressive approaches to community mobilization are being developed and expanded. And in 2017, Manitoba established the Manitoba Community Mobilization and Safety Initiatives Network. Next slide, please. This network is a voluntary organization that's comprised of representatives from each of the community mobilization initiatives. And it provides a collaborative platform to support capacity building of the local initiatives, as well as knowledge exchange, sharing resources, capacity building. It's important to highlight that unlike the community mobilization initiatives in Saskatchewan and Ontario, Manitoba Justice has not dictated the mandate of this network. It is not disproportionately comprised of representatives from policing, nor is the objective of the network to impose a standardized model of community mobilization. In contrast, this network employs a non-hierarchical structure. The members of the network collectively set the strategic priorities, and consensus-based decision-making is used. The flow of information and resources are not highly concentrated and controlled by the state, but rather it provides a platform for membership to share their local experiences and to learn from one another. In this regard, the Manitoba Community Mobilization Safety Initiatives Network governance structure aligns with the characteristics of a network model of nodal governance, whereby plural policing providers link together in horizontal partnerships in the co-production of security. Prioritizing community engagement and local leadership of community mobilization in Manitoba demonstrates a more democratic and just alternative to the more micromanaged and regulated governance models in other jurisdictions. What follows is an overview now of the Manitoba models of community mobilization.
Thanks, Nadine. So there are 12 community mobilization units and 3 types, and I'll be talking about the START model. The START model is a coordinated interagency case planning program for high-risk youth in Selkirk and Manitoba and the surrounding area, which utilizes community and family resources to intervene, plan for, and support youth. It is described as a consent-based, culturally inclusive, and client-based, client-centered program. It also involves partnership between various agencies included but not limited to the RCMP, child welfare, addiction services, education, as well as numerous community organizations. A screening committee determines eligibility for support, which requires the involvement of a minimum of 3 of the partner agencies. Support also includes an in-house risk assessment and the development, implementation, and monitoring of an integrated intervention plan. And one of the key components of START is the central role that the youth and their family play in determining the plan of support. So next slide, please. So modified hubs, 3 CM initiatives in Manitoba, including Brandon's, Thompson, and Swan River use the hub model. It's important to note that these 3 initiatives represents important modification to the more traditional hub model, such as the addition of consent-based, person-centered follow-up in addition to risk intervention. This is more evidence of local autonomy and innovation in Manitoba's community mobilization, meaning the implementation of the hub has not been static, but rather it has continued to evolve in progressive ways. So with that, it's over to you, Rebeca. Thank you.
Ring is a consent-based and culturally responsive support that employs a multidimensional approach to crime prevention to foster intersectoral collaboration and identify and implement long-term sustainable solutions that facilitate community safety and well-being. It coordinates and mobilizes existing resources to give individuals and families the support they need to prevent crisis situations and achieve longer-term stability. It includes community organizations as part of the leadership table and in the provision of direct support. Thunderwing engages in crime prevention through social development by supporting improved housing, better access to wellness, and a revitalization of the neighborhood's infrastructure. Now, the next slide is the community wraparound model is a consent-based and person-centered planning process that incorporates the implementation of Canadian high-fidelity wraparound to support high-risk youth and their families through the development of a highly individualized plan. Community care serves as a hub in the local community. In addition to facilitating the provision of wraparound support, it provides a broad range of community supports, including but not limited to a food bank, access to subsidized housing, parenting support. In this way, community care also engages in crime prevention to foster community safety and well-being. Now, community support team involves a partnership between several agencies and local community organizations. Staff from the local school division are certified wraparound facilitators, and they facilitate the provision of wraparound support. The development of a single wraparound plan that is integrated across service providers reduces service fragmentation and helps to foster shared accountability among all stakeholders. Community support team is further differentiated by its strong focus on the incorporation of natural helpers from the local community in addition to formal services.
Great, thank you. So we're over time, but the preliminary analysis of our interviews show that the Manitoba models have a potential for crime prevention that co-produces community-grounded definitions and practices of public safety. There's evidence of local autonomy, the incorporation of community-based activist groups, consent-based programming, and flexible and adaptable responses, and horizontal collaborative partnerships. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that presentation. I think for many of us, the idea of a nodal network and the government involvement of that is quite a new thing. So now I'm going to turn over to our last presenter, Vincent Eagan, coming to us from Wilfrid Laurier. Vincent will be speaking about reframing Indigenous blockades after Section 35 of the Constitution Act. Vincent, please turn on your camera and/or mic and take it away.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the other presenters. I'm just going to share my screen here. I'm retired after 39 years of Canadian policing and only present as a student and declare no conflict of interest. This is a course paper out of the Wilfrid Laurier Policing BA program, police officer cohort. I'm also an undergraduate student in Laurentian in a BA in forensic identification, which is more to do with physical evidence. This is about reframing Indigenous blockades after Section 35 of the Constitution Act in regards to police operations. Just bear with me. My legal theory-based paper is that in future, Indigenous land and water defenders will have competing status, legitimacy, as police officers do now in the field of public safety. My too lengthy paper explores the law of the land meaning between Indigenous-based ideologies and Western Magna Carta meanings, differential and valid perspectives on critical infrastructure, the honor of the Crown duties normally considered for negotiations with Indigenous applied to police as also being agents of the Crown. Canadian bilingualism to pluralism and Indigenous nation to nation frameworks, parity and full accreditation for Indigenous officers. My paper tracks some cases where the economic interests of corporations are less relevant than the claims of the protesters, such as the Standing Rock Sioux Tribe versus the United States Army Corps in the Fosberg decision in 2020. The environmental baselines, corporate wells, dine and dash, and the corporate credibility in the larger debate. So the law of the land component, lex terra, in Western traditions appears in 1215 Magna Carta, involving due process, common law, and public law. The role for police is in peace, order, and good governance. At the risk of appropriation and generalization, in many Indigenous contexts, this law of the land has an arguably equal valid context, such as the Constitution of the State of Nation 2018 as stewards of land and water, Nunatsu Labrador Inuit Land Claims Agreement Act, the mandate to preserve land, culture, and resources. And there are many modern land treaties, but too numerous to mention here. Critical infrastructure. Do police get to use a preemptive rule book? We do now. It becomes currently this becomes national and more preemptive. Protests are exercising their legitimate rights to do so. Example is the RCMP project, SIPTA, that assigned a criminality potential scoring to some 89 out of 313 protesters for participating in land claims types meetings and rallies. I liken this to the UK science and pre-crime debate that was mentioned earlier in the last presentation, where statutory duty was placed on all public sector workers using 22 scoring factors to identify signs of radicalization. Critical infrastructure, the sustainability meaning is more important in indigeneity, the focus of and legitimacy of for environmental justice and preserving the environment and legacy. And I have an image of Crystal, two bulls in the bottom, a protester, an Iraqi war veteran. And there had been a lawsuit against her, Greenpeace, and the Red Warriors under a RICO organized crime provision, and that was not successful against her because she had no control over the other protesters, and the economic arguments of the suers didn't matter as much. The honor of the crown, and I'm going a different direction here, because that's normally applied to negotiators and honoring the treaty. And in that context, I argue police as agents of the crown also have the fiduciary duty to honor the crown. And there's a number of Supreme Court decisions that spell that out and clarify that, as well as the principles found in the PRC, the RCAP, and United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. Reconciliation, free and informed consent, cooperative federalism, distinction-based approaches, and nation-to-nation negotiating. This, I argue for police, involves integrity and appreciation of the intentions of the treaty of the past, including the oral records and the more unwritten things, and police acknowledging protesters in the first instance have legitimacy to their demands. An example of the unwritten, where I live in Treaty 18 in Ontario, circa 1818, there was a provision to have a doctor proximal to reserves. That's unwritten, and that doesn't exist other than orally or in archival records. In Canada, we've evolved to some legal pluralism now from bilingualism. Multiple legal forms coexist, diversity, multi-culturalism. I cite Burroughs on that 2005, the simultaneous existence within a single legal order pluralism, the simultaneous existence within a different legal order, different rules of law applying to identical situations. Burroughs considers Canada a multi-jurisdictional country sourced from common law, civil law, and indigenous legal traditions. The Aga Khan has a center for pluralism, and he studied civilizations throughout history which survived to support that argument. I argue for parity and full accreditation for Indigenous officers. The Indigenous officers seem to be absent or not part of many confrontations we see playing out in the media. The RCMP made special constables regular members as they were doing the same job. Alberta is seeking reform in Bill 38, the Justice Statutes Amendment Act 2020, more recognition for Indigenous officers. And Ontario has the Community Safety and Policing Act 2019, which affords more Indigenous officer recognition and ban control of the hiring and firing of officers. It doesn't go far enough because there's still, as special constables, are a different designation than a regular member. There's still definitional distinctions being made. The Community Safety and Policing Act in 2019 does mandate that police officers get training in Indigenous issues, and part of my program at Wilfrid Laurier were 2 courses written by Professor Monchon. Since writing this paper last year, these issues have moved forward, such as adoption of United Nations steps, such as our versus so in Washington and DC. I had for the of the accredited land protectors, this no less of a public safety appointment. I've passed these officers. Government should provide authority for policing alternate cultural models. If anyone wants to contact me, I would comment on Professor Schneider's lived experience. There's maybe suggest another keyword. In the last few years, this lived experience in the courtroom, the Ipsit evidence has become a debate over anecdotal evidence, and that's been challenged more and more in the courtroom context, saying you're qualified to state that only based on your experience presents a problem. And that might be another keyword for this qualitative media analysis, which sounds very interesting. Thank you. I'll pass it back to the chair.
Thank you so much, Vincent. We appreciate that. So we've got about 10 minutes now for questions and answers. I'd like to thank all the panelists for their really interesting and related, but also diverse presentations this morning. So we've got a first question coming in for Kelsey. So Kelsey, the question is to ask a little bit more about your sample and how you got access, and maybe the next stage of your data collection that you're anticipating. So Kelsey, I welcome you to turn your mic and your camera on and let us know a little bit more about the sample you use, as well as access and maybe the next stage of your data collection. Thanks.
Essentially, all of our data came from our websites. We were able to get it from Gallup, the Lloyd's Foundation. It's all published online. So we compiled it from there into a database, and then did the analysis further from there. As far as the next steps go, I'm more really interested in trying to collect data from 2019, 2020, 2021, when the discussion has kind of been at the forefront, to see what the more recent trends are, as well as looking at some of the police forces. Like in Saskatchewan, Regina Police, the RCMP, and SPS all run community satisfaction surveys. So looking at those questionnaires as well, just to kind of see what the views are locally. And then we'll continue to go to those main sources online and use as a comparison from that as well. Hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, thank you, Kelsey. I see that Christopher has been answering some questions coming in. Could you identify a number of key activities or key starting points for a grassroots organization that may want to start looking at some mobilization activities?
Nadine, you can answer that if you want.
Key activities. Well, I mean, one of the key themes that we're finding is really just a commitment in the community to change. And many of the communities in Manitoba that have started community mobilization initiatives are areas of high crime. And so because of that, there's been this sort of grassroots connection to make change in the community and commitment. So first, having a group of stakeholders that really wants to engage is one. And, you know, unfortunately, having some kind of, and leadership for sure, having sort of a designated lead in that process. And funding as well has come up as an essential piece to create sustainability. And recently there's been some increase in funding in our province, which I think has been helpful. And so those are kind of a couple of pieces that, and I think, you know, establishing within communities a sense of trust. in our study right now, as we interview people in the local communities, trust has been essential. So trust amongst agency partners, trust amongst people living and residing in the communities has been another real critical kind of element to it. And I think too, you know, like one of the presentations was about trust in the police. I think really interesting, many of the initiatives that we're looking at are in rural communities. And I noted in the study that Kelsey shared this higher level of trust in rural areas with police. And I think that's something that we're seeing as well, that because many of the initiatives are rural, there is that sense of the police are on our side. And I think that has helped build some partnerships as well. Thanks.
In the North End, the Thunderwing project in the North End, there's been a lot of independent kinds of they're not necessarily groups, but they're interests. And I know that they have been able to talk to the people who work in Thunderwing as a way to help them overcome the systemic kinds of barriers, and really just as a knowledge generation. And it's very different because they don't trust police. And for, I think, some good reasons. And I think the stuff that Chris was talking about in terms of silos, I think that the mobilization units might be an opportunity to get rid of those silos. It's sort of a way to talk about, so communities can talk about their needs, which is very different, I think, than the traditional forms of policing, which is clearly not based on needs.
Thank you very much, Kelly and Nadine. And looks like the last question we have time for is coming in for Vincent. So Vincent, the question is asking about whether you saw or came across jurisdictional differences. You mentioned speaking about your experience with Ontario, particularly differences in Indigenous officers and the use of Indigenous officers across different provinces in Canada, if you came across any of that in your work.
Where I finished policing in York wasn't a whole lot of contact with Indigenous or the urban Indigenous that flocked to downtown Toronto or as Western Canada cities. There was the Chippewas of Georgina. In the 80s, I worked for the RCMP in Saskatchewan in a remote limited duration posting for 2 years, and there was a lot of Indigenous there, and at the time there was RCMP special constables and slight distinctions in the uniform, and they were doing the same job, but there was an informal hierarchy or formal hierarchy in their status, and that's been changed. In Ontario, they changed the Police Act, as it were, with new legislation, and they're making the racialized and Indigenous course content mandatory, but there's still work to do because they're still framed like a special constable or specific to their community in that. And I don't know, there's a hierarchy between the RCMP and municipal police. And when I went through Depot, that was kind of encouraged as a way of thinking. You bought into that narrative, and that works against your effectiveness as a police officer if you think you're better than another agency. Thank you.
That's wonderful. Thanks a lot. Well, I'd like to again thank the panelists for their engaging presentations. I'm sure we could continue all morning to talk about the different findings related to your work. I see that it's 11:15 here in Winnipeg, so it's actually time for our coffee break. I hope that you'll be coming back to join us for our featured speaker, as well as our later panel today. And I hope everyone has a wonderful coffee break. So again, just thank you for our panelists, and thank you for everyone for coming and attending, and enjoy your 15 minutes to stretch and grab a coffee and enjoy some outside time. Take care, everyone. Bye.